Good afternoon. I'm Ann Phibbs, Director of Education for the Office for Equity and Diversity. Welcome to Pride Not Pity, Disability as Culture, our 7th and final conversation in this year's Critical Conversations about Diversity and Justice series. The Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries. The libraries have developed a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversation topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversations webpage. We continue to offer live streaming of our conversations so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they will be archived on that Critical Conversations webpage. And we've also added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series. If you signed in, we'll email a link to an online evaluation, or you can access that link also on our website. As with all of our conversations, we'll start with some discussion from our panelists and then move out into the audience for question and answer. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Tammy Berbery. Tammy has been Associate Professor of French on the Morris campus of the University of Minnesota for the past 15 years, so I really appreciate her making the drive all the way from Morris to be with us here today. She's former president of the Society for Disability Studies, a national organization of scholars, activists, and artists working in disability studies. She's been working in disability advocacy and higher education for more than 20 years. She is the co-editor of Worlds Apart, Disability and Foreign Language Learning, published in 2008, co-editor with Christian Flau of a special issue of the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies on disability in French and Francophone words, published in summer 2016. Personally, I think that's a little bit light in terms of a bio, but that's kind of Tammy. I think she's a little, she's not likely to blow her own horn. But as someone who works here in Equity and Diversity at the University of Minnesota, both done some work on the Morris campus and here in the Twin Cities, Tammy's been part of a lot of important diversity efforts on the Morris campus and is part of our leadership program here in the Twin Cities, our LEAD program, and just brings a tremendous commitment and passion and positivity to the work. I just felt the need to throw that in, and I'm really thrilled that she has agreed to serve as our moderator, so please welcome Tammy. Thanks.
Microphone. Are we on? Are we on? Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that today is the National Day of Silence, and I want to honor queer identities and the personal and political struggles and accomplishments of LGBTQIA2S people. I'd like to introduce my panelists, Jacob Collin, Angela Carter, Amy Hewitt, and Wendy Harbour. Thanks to our ASL interpreters, Lori Krause, Ryan Teal, and Keisha Farrand for interpreting our conversation today. And I'd like to begin by inviting our panelists to introduce themselves.
All right. Let's see. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Okay. Just trying to judge the distance here. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Jacob Colon. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Minnesota with a major in child psychology and a minor in Chicanx, Latinx studies. A little bit about myself. I was the former president of the Disabled Student Cultural Center and also served on the board of the La Raza Student Cultural Center. And currently, I'm interning over at the Harriet Tubman Center in South Minneapolis, and I'm serving as an access consultant of sorts for the Somali Museum of Minnesota.
Hi, I'm Angela Carter. I'm a PhD candidate and graduate instructor in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, or GWIS, here on campus. I am a steering committee member of the Society for Disability Studies Queer Caucus, and I'm also a co-founder of the Critical Disability Studies Collaborative here on campus. I do research and teaching. My passions in research and teaching are in feminist disability studies and queer theory and disability studies, or CRIP theory, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Is this on? Okay. My name is Wendy Harbour, and I have deep roots here at the University of Minnesota. I'm an alum I got my bachelor's and a master's here, and I worked at the DRC for about 7 years. Right now, I'm running the National Center for College Students with Disabilities, and you can see some of our propaganda over on the table over there. And that's based at the Association on Higher Ed and Disability, which is called AHEAD. It's a brand new federally funded center. And I'm also a member of the National Council on Disability, but today my opinions are all little old me.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy Hewitt. I work here at the University of Minnesota at a place that's not well known on campus called the Institute on Community Integration. I'm a researcher and study issues related to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and run a certificate program available here and on campus on disability policy and services.
Thank you. So we have decided to launch this conversation with the university community by raising 3 ways of thinking about disability culture. We'll discuss each of them for about 15 minutes and then open participation to the audience. And I get to make all the rules, which is kind of fun. I'm a mom too, so I'm used to this role. And I am going to use my phone to time things so that we can address everything that we've brainstormed together. It is my role as moderator to move things along, but if there's something that comes up that you want to revisit, please, by all means, let's do that when we open the discussion to audience participation. Also, if you are honoring the Day of Silence and you want to submit a comment or question on a piece of paper, that works very well. Please stop us at any time if we can do something differently to make the conversation easier for you to follow. And it would be great if you would state your name each time before you speak. Finally, I invite you to use the space in whatever ways are comfortable for you. There's lots of space in here, so it's a long conversation too, an hour and a half. So if you feel like you want to stand up and do a 7th inning stretch or walk around the room, that's very welcome. So the first question that I have for you is just about disability culture as a concept, as an idea. I wonder if you could each offer your thoughts about what disability culture is to you and what it accomplishes for people with disabilities and for others. I don't want to micro-time you, so I'm not going to grab the microphone away from you. But we'll devote about 15 minutes to each question, and as you know, I have sub-questions too. So if we could keep responses to about 3 minutes per person, that would be super duper.
So I guess I'm just going to start with a definition of culture first off that I got from Merriam-Webster. It is, and I'll just read the first half of it, is the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. And then I also gathered parts of another definition from dictionary.com. It's that these practices they could be manifested through language, art, institutions, and material objects. And so I guess with specifically with disability culture, I'm still trying to wrap my head around because it's a pretty big concept. But I guess what I can do is I can give like some examples of what I've seen in the past, especially with participating in the DSCC. So I've seen like disability culture manifested through art. For example, we've had some deaf and hard of hearing performers on campus. A couple of them, I believe, were hip hop artists. And we've also had plays on campus. So I guess when I think of culture in a sense, especially disability culture, I guess I'm more associated with like its manifestations of through art and language, which are usually like the big ones for me, or at least from what I've seen most often. Yeah. So.
Tammy, do you want us to respond to just this first question or the sub-questions too? Just the first one? Okay. Yep. Great. Thank you. When I think about disability culture, I think of world making. And this is coming from my another part of my identity, which is as a queer femme woman. And so I think about culture as a space for dreaming and collecting and building space or imagining other worlds are possible together, and that can be through art or writing or activism or any number of cultural productions similar to the things that Jacob just mentioned. I think that what disability culture has done for me, or it does for disabled folks, is it gives us a space to connect to one another, because disability can be and has historically been a very isolating experience and embodiment and identity. So disability culture allows us to connect to other folks. I think for able-bodied minded people, disability culture can allow for a relearning or an unlearning of some of the misinformation that society teaches about disability. So I think becoming aware of disability culture can allow able-bodied minded folks to break down some of the stereotypes or the misunderstandings they might unconsciously hold about disabled people.
I agree with both of you about your definitions, but I would just add, I work with college students, and one of the things that college students are doing is they're trying to figure out who they are. And that's one reason I love my job. One of the things that I think disability culture brings to the table is just it gives permission to go ahead and explore what it means to your identity to have a disability. And even if you decide you don't like the word, or even if you decide you don't want to be a part of a disability community, you can still think about disability as an identity. And I think that's really important, because if you start rejecting pieces of yourself, that can become a problem for other parts of your identity. So I think disability culture really can be a powerful thing for people figuring out who they are.
So I'm not a person who identifies as having a disability. I do have a sibling who has autism, and that's really how I've learned about disability culture and disability cultural awareness is by people with disabilities who've taught me about it. And so from my perspective, people who have disabilities and identify together as a group of individuals with shared experiences, and as I've seen people in developmental disabilities we call a self-advocacy movement, you might call that an activist movement in other categorical disability groups. But as I've seen people engage in advocacy on behalf of their own selves and their own needs and what they want, and social justice for themselves and who they are as individuals, it's just affirmed for me that disability culture is something that does exist and is something that our communities need to be more educated about.
So I'm hoping that each of you won't mind addressing how you came to an awareness of disability as culture, or disability as identity, if you prefer to think of it that way, and whether and how your relationship to disability culture and identities has evolved.
So I guess I'll talk more about like my relationship to disability culture. Like I guess I guess I really came into contact with the disability as a culture more so when I started here at the University of Minnesota. Just because in high school, I mean, I went to high school in rural Minnesota, and there wasn't at least that many folks who identified as having a disability, except for myself and another student. But in terms of disability as a culture, I would have to say, like in college, especially when I started meeting other folks with disabilities, either through the DRC or through the DSCC, and going to events where I actually got to see like performers, plays, like just other forms of performance itself, and then just meeting with other people who identify as having disabilities and are from various backgrounds as well. And I guess like over the years, I guess I've seen more and more of its how it manifests, how disability culture manifests in various ways.
So I became disabled about 10 years ago, and so my coming into disability was very different. I came into it through an experience that then sort of changed my whole life when I became disabled. And so my entry into disability culture and identity came from my nerdiness, right? So I've always been a nerd, and so after I became disabled, I was like, oh man, I don't understand what's happening to me and how society is treating me and how I'm experiencing society now in new ways. I need to go read a bunch of books about it, right? And so that's what I did. And I came into works by Eli Clare and other disability scholar activists and educators and writers. And then I got connected through those readings to groups like Sins Invalid, which is a San Francisco-based Bay Area group of predominantly queer disabled people of color, and they do spoken word poetry. And through them, I also got into reading and hearing activists like Mia Mingus and Lydia Brown talk about disability activism as culture, and that really inspired me. So I think that my entry into disability culture came through my nerdiness. But then it's shifted after my first time at the Society for Disability Studies, which is the national foundation or an organization for disability scholars and activists that Tammy spoke of earlier. And that was a great experience for my nerdiness, but Saturday night of the conference is the dance. And the disability studies dance is famous for how amazing it is, and I had no idea what I was walking into. I was a dancer all through high school when I was able-bodied minded, and dancing has been a big part of my resistance and revolution as a queer person, but all of a sudden I was in the space with a bunch of disabled folks who were just going to town and having so much fun and being so inspired and dancing with each other, and I saw culture in a way that I had never seen before. It wasn't language, it wasn't academic, it wasn't words, it was movement and possibility, and it just changed how I felt about myself and I felt about being in community. So I think that moment was the real moment that I felt like, aha, there is something here, and it's something I am a part of. Then lastly, and I will pass on, I think that my thoughts have shifted or are evolving now because my partner has a 9-year-old daughter, and so I'm now in a step-parent role, and she is disabled, and I am realizing that all of my nerdiness means nothing to her as a 9-year-old. And she, all the language that I've read and all the things that I use to teach about disability and talk about disability on college campus don't translate to a third grader. And so I am really now trying to think about what disability culture means for young folks, and that's new for me.
I came to disability culture through deaf culture. So I lost my hearing very slowly and eventually figured out that sign language is not mime and it's not, little boxes and things. And as I started learning American Sign Language, I started learning about deaf culture, and I started meeting deaf people who were very proud to be deaf, didn't think it needed to be fixed, very proud of deaf history and deaf arts and deaf community and culture. And so I arrived at the University of Minnesota as a transfer student, very much a deaf radical. And I was told to go over to the Disabled Student Cultural Center, which was brand new at that time. And I was skeptical because deaf people don't always embrace the term disabled for themselves. And I showed up and I met all these other students with disabilities who felt similarly about their disabilities as I did about my deafness. They were talking about disability, history, and arts, and culture, and community, and they were proud of themselves and who they were as people with disabilities. And it kind of clicked for me in my mind, and then I became a radical disability activist. Yeah. And I was disappointed if I didn't get arrested in protest. And so that was a really exciting time for me, and I started to think a lot about about that. And my friend at that time, Jean Chelberg. He said, if we don't have disability culture, then we need it. And I really like that phrase. I really thought that was a great idea. My relationship with disability culture kind of ebbs and flows over the years. I became a disability studies professor, and that actually sort of simultaneously reinforced and pushed me away from disability culture, because often people with disabilities don't get the deaf thing, and sometimes there would be disability films that weren't captioned or disability events that didn't have interpreters, and I felt really marginalized sometimes. But we had a Disabled and Proud conference for students in 2011, and any idea that there wasn't a disability culture kind of dissipated for me, because I brought together 200 college students with disabilities, and probably 3 people in the room knew the term disability culture. But somehow, magically, disability culture happened, and they all started connecting to each other and seeing commonalities, and it was a really powerful experience for everyone to see that happening in real time. It was very powerful.
So as I was thinking about this question when I got it from Tammy, I sort of come at this really from 3 different aspects. One is having watched my brother-in-law Nathan the first time he really got around a group of other people who had autism and developmental disabilities, and he began to learn about what disability was, what autism was. He had grown up, he got a label pretty late in life, at about age 17, which is quite late for a person with autism. So he kind of always felt like he was isolated, he was alone. And when he began a leadership training program offered by an organization in town called Wilderness Inquiry, our institute was actually helping them develop a leadership training program for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Just watching him blossom and watching him gain confidence and feel a part of a group of people that he really didn't understand, and it was really about himself. So some of it was the self-identity piece. Another lens that I kind of come at it from is watching the exclusion of people with intellectual disabilities from the broader disability community. That's a little bit hard to say, and a lot of, not everybody, it's not everybody's experience, but people with intellectual disabilities are often excluded from the broader disability culture for a variety of reasons that I'm sure we'll be able to talk about later. So in my role as an ally for people with intellectual disabilities, pushing that agenda. For example, on many university campuses in this country, people with intellectual disabilities can enroll and they go to college. That does not happen on this campus for a lot of reasons. So watching that is another kind of opposite maybe angle at coming at the issue of disability culture, but it's very clear it exists when you're a person with a disability and you may be excluded from it.
Great, thank you. I guess I want to just raise the point that you all can talk to each other too. We don't have to just keep going up and down the table. So I want to talk to you for a minute about whether or not, it sounds like, Amy, you have some really significant reservations about disability culture in terms of solidarity and exclusions within some imagined community, and so, which becomes very real at the SDS dance. But I wonder if we could just share a little bit about whether you have any reservations about disability culture.
Let's see, reservations. Well, I guess for me, it's coming from a perspective of someone who also identifies as Chicano, or Chicano Latino, and I guess like on a base level, I guess a lot of the performances that I've seen, or a lot of the, like in terms of manifestations of disability culture, a lot of it is, and this is just, I guess, from my experience, a lot of it is like, for example, like in one language, most of what I've seen is either if it's spoken, it's a lot of it is in English, and it's spoke, and it's told through very few perspectives. So I guess there's, I guess I get like for me from when I experience it, there's a little bit of exclusion just because it's not like on the level like say if I see something about blindness, it's great and all, but it's missing one perspective, and that's like the perspective of those who are blind and those who are also of color, and or I guess just seeing identity, and it's really tough because like with disability culture, it's also when you want to bring inclusion, and I guess I'm just trying to figure out like how, because people with disabilities, that I'm pretty sure that's not like their only identity. They are, folks like my fellow panelists here, folks are or LGBTQ, and there are just even like socioeconomic backgrounds. It's like how can we address this all in disability culture, and it'd be pretty neat to figure to figure that out. That'll be a process within itself, but I guess those are some of my reservations.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, for bringing that up about the ways that people get excluded. Is I think that absolutely does happen, and just like any kind of community or culture that we talk about, there is not one disabled community or culture, just like there's not one GLBT community or culture or one Black culture or one immigrant culture. There's a whole bunch of subgroups or subcultures, and try as we might, there becomes hierarchies in really problematic ways that we have to be conscious of and work to undo. So I think that is absolutely true, and I could share some experiences on that. But I think instead I want to say something different to this question, which is I get hesitant about the focus on disability as culture, because I worry that if we spend too much time or only think about disability as culture or disability as identity, then we're not also thinking about, or it could pull us away from remembering that disability also serves as a category of oppression. And so it is also a sort of a rubric of meaning making, or a ways in which society makes meaning on bodies and puts meaning on different types of body minds. And then those meanings are used to justify systems of inequality and limits of life chances. So this is my feminist coming out, as you might see. Because as much as I love culture and I love identity, and it's so important for disabled people and for able-bodied-minded people to see, I also think that we have to remember that this isn't just an identity, and it's not just something to be celebrated. It should be celebrated, and it is an identity, and also it's a way that systems of power have worked to marginalize folks. And we have to think about that if we're going to change systems to change experiences.
I was at an ice cream store a few months ago, and there was this really adorable gay couple in front of me, probably 19, 20 years old, and I just couldn't help myself, right? So I as the older lesbian behind them in line, I was like, oh my God, you two are adorable. And then my wife came in, and the four of us were chatting and having this great conversation, and we bought their ice cream for them, and it was just beautiful. And the other thing too is I'm deaf, so like I travel a lot for work, and often in airports I'll spot deaf people a mile away, and I'm like, hey, and my name is Wendy, and where are you from? And we start doing this deaf thing of connecting. And so it's always interesting for me to do that with LGBTQ people and with deaf people. But I see, like, I was at a rest stop on the freeway, and there was this cute little girl with a bright pink sparkly wheelchair, and I wanted to just run over to her and start chatting, and I thought, Mom will call security. There's not that instant connection when I see people with disabilities. And so as someone who's very familiar with culture in two other ways, I don't see that same connection in the disability community, although just for the record, I did go over there. The way I did it was I said I work with college students who have disabilities. It's never too early to start talking about college. So, honey, I know you're only 5 or 6, but have you thought about where you're going to school? But I think for me, that really shows that disability culture isn't always there. And I think it's because disability can also be a really tragic, horrible thing. I mean, people die from their disabilities. And I think disability can be something you want to get rid of. Like if you're in a lot of pain, or, think about how many older people try to hide when they're hard of hearing or they can't see well. It's something they're ashamed of. And so I think, again, disability culture should be there. It should exist, but it doesn't. And so I go back and forth, struggling with what that means for me and for the community at large.
So my academic background is social work, and when I was in school, we would talk about all the other cultural groups, but disability was virtually omitted from curriculum. 30 years later, it's included in most schools of social work, but then it wasn't. And so I was always kind of wanting it to be there and wanting us to give disability as much attention as we give lots of other marginalized groups. So I've never really questioned that disability culture exists. It's more how people identify with it and how that culture and the intersectionality, which I know we'll get to later. People are complex and people are individuals, and most people wouldn't just identify as a person with a disability. So while disability, I don't really question whether disability culture exists, I don't think most people identify as only being a part of a disability culture.
Great. So I have to be timekeeper for a second. That was so fun. I let it go. But now we're a little bit behind. So what we're going to do is, if we could be a little briefer on the next question, and then the third question we'll open up for everybody to talk about disability here in university spaces. So the second question we talked about is just disability identity and building solidarity. And we can spend 12 minutes on this question. And so how does disability, Jacob, you talked about this a little bit already, but how does disability intersect with with your other identities? Or how does disability culture or disability communities intersect with other cultural locations and communities that you're a part of? This time we'll try reading the whole big question, and then it'll go a little quicker maybe. What experiences do you guys have building alliances around intersections of disability, race, economic inequality, gender, sexuality, or citizen status? What are characteristics of allies? What suggestions do you have for anyone who wants to be an ally for people with disabilities? And how can people with disabilities become allies for people of color, women, LGBTQIA 2S people, or other groups within the disability community and culture? And then finally, about language. Which terms do you wish people would use more? Which terminology is in-group language that allies should avoid? Not much, Jacob.
I guess I'll start with a little bit, because I know I briefly mentioned intersectionality, but in terms of my identity, I've always seen disability as more of just like a layer in it. Like I see my identity as like multi-layered. So when I get asked to, try and separate those out, it's pretty tough just because I can't talk about having a disability without talking about also my experience as a working class Latino person. Even by location too, growing up on the West Coast in California, because the culture there is a lot different than say like the Midwest. So I guess in terms of intersectionality, it just plays a part in my outlook on myself and my worldview, and I guess disability culture. Well, I guess I can talk a little bit about my work with the DSCC, since I've worked with another gentleman who's a good friend of mine who's also a person of color who has a disability, and we've often had conversations about how like disability plays in our lives. he's from a different background than I am, and so we kind of compare ideas and kind of compare notes on like how disability has played a part um, in the greater in our greater life experiences. Um, let's see here. That's a lot. And building. Oh, I guess in terms of alliances. So I get this gentleman, this friend of mine, through our work with the DSCC, we've I guess in our own personal lives ourselves is, for example, like I said, I am currently working at the Somali Museum as an access consultant. So like looking about how to create more accessible spaces within specifically their museum. So for example, they're thinking of adding audio description to some of their exhibits. They're planning on putting some videos in and adding audio description to those, just to kind of get a feel, or trying to get more folks within the greater Somali community who may also identify as having a disability to feel more welcome in that community space. So I've kind of see that form of like alliance in itself, creating like accessing culture. And then the cool thing about it too is these audio descriptions will be multilingual, so they'll be in English and in Somali, which is pretty cool. I guess I'll just stop there and there.
I'm going to try to answer some of those questions, but not all of them, so other folks can have more time. I think that, like Jacob said, my identity as a disabled person deeply intersects with my other identities, particularly around my identity as growing up as a working class, working poor person, and also my queer identity. So I think of myself in solidarity with lots of my friends that identify as autistic, because my disabilities, some of my disabilities are cognitive, and that makes actually making sentences at this time of day difficult, so that's part of why I'm struggling. But we identify or talk about ourselves as neuroqueer, right? And so that's a way to think about how our experiences queer or challenge or disrupt the normative ideas of cognition, or how our minds should work, right? And so I'm thinking of a lot of the autistic activists that I'm friends with that term. And I think disability complicates my class identity, because working class folks are at the same time often disabled because of their work environments, or become disabled because of the hard physical labor that they work. But at the same time, there is a lot of deep ableism in working class cultures, because the last thing you want to do is become disabled or be disabled, because then you can't work hard, right? And so there are these misconceptions about what it means to be disabled and be someone that works hard in the world. And so there's a lot of contradiction in that class, in my class identity. I also think that my disabilities allow me to pass, and that gives me various privileges that intersect with my whiteness in ways that I have to acknowledge. Most of the time, no one, it's not apparent that I'm disabled unless I tell you I'm in a lot of pain right now, or unless you say, why do you wear funny glasses? Or why can you not make a sentence this evening, And so that makes, as Wendy was saying, that makes building solidarity difficult in some ways, because no one's going to look at me and say, oh, there's another disabled person, we can talk at the airport, because my disabilities aren't visible. I think in terms of building solidarity, there's a lot of work to be done, and I think about this with my feminism in lots of ways, that disability is often the last thing to be considered, if considered at all, and yet in my understanding of it, disability is deeply prominent in systems of racism and classism and citizenship and immigration and all kinds of other vectors of oppression. And yet I have a really hard time getting some of my friends and colleagues and people I respect to think about how, well, disability, Black Lives Matter is about disability. And immigration is about disability, and we have to think about all of these things at once. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in building alliances. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass the mic, is that I think that the biggest thing for being an ally is to listen and educate yourself. Listen more than you talk and educate yourself, which I think is true if you want to be an ally to any marginalized group. But I also think for disabled people, the biggest thing for us to do in being an ally among ourselves or to other disabled folks is to always do work to center the most marginalized people in our community. So center or think about not just what would make my life better as a white educated disabled person, but what about the disabled person who is a person of color and an immigrant, or doesn't have an education and doesn't know how to navigate the bureaucracies of the medical industrial complex, or doesn't have parental support in the way that I might have, or things like this. So I think that we have to, as disabled people, constantly think not just about our own experiences as disabled and our own struggles, but to think about other disabled folks who experience even more intersecting vectors of oppression than we might. I'll stop there.
Being conscious of the time, I'm trying to figure out how to prioritize what I want to say. I'm white, but my son is black and he has disabilities. And a few years ago, I had a chance to do a 4-year project with historically black colleges and universities, and we worked on what disability services looks like at HBCUs and whether predominantly white institutions can steal some ideas from them. And you know, one of the biggest things I learned is when you want to be an ally, you should be willing to sit down, shut up, and listen. And so I did a lot of listening during the years of the HBCU project. I was the only white person on the project, and I was really privileged to be able to work with this group of people. And simple things like, you know, in disability studies, we teach to avoid the word overcoming, right? Overcoming is a bad word because then you're being a super crip and denying your disability and trying to look normal and pass. And obviously, in Black and African American culture, overcoming is a really powerful word with a really strong history. And my baggage about overcoming kind of clashed with their love for the word, and it became a really interesting conversation and an article about what we learned about each other and about the language we use and how quickly the white disability studies narrative becomes the dominant one, and how easily and quickly people of color and immigrants and people who are poor are their definitions and their ideas about what disability studies means aren't always brought forward. So I'm just very conscious of that, and I don't think there's any beyond sit down, shut up, and listen. I don't think there's a lot you can say about such an individual experience. I mean, all of us are bringing all of ourselves to any conversation about disability, and of course we're going to have different ideas about what that means. And I'm troubled right now too by the lack of compassion I see in many of these discussions. I see liberals calling Trump mentally ill, and I see conservatives using the word libtard, and I see a place for disability studies to maybe say, you know what, let's just stop for a second and let's have a conversation about what that means when you use those words or you talk that way, or when you set up a climate of fear or disrespect for any group, then people with disabilities are watching. And, you know, Angela said, you can't see my disability. Well, you see that I'm deaf, but you don't see my asthma. And that's much more of a disability than the deafness. And so I sit there and I figure out quickly how people feel about other groups, and then I decide whether or not it's safe to disclose parts of who I am. So I think it's just the university has a chance to be a place where conversations like that can happen.
Well, adding to the sit down, shut up, and listen, a phrase that we use a lot in my work is nothing about us without us. And so in thinking about my role as an ally and a researcher, one of the things that's really important to me is that I'm not doing any research that's not going to have meaning for policy and practice related to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it just doesn't happen that we would develop a research proposal that doesn't have input from and designed by people with intellectual disabilities and what they would like to see the data used for. So I think that's a really important role of mine as an ally. And then also, I'm involved in a number of national organizations related to intellectual and developmental disabilities. And one of the things that we work really hard at is forging partnerships with other national organizations to shape federal policy and state policy. And I see that as an important role. The opportunity to bridge with other marginalized groups around healthcare reform has been a really interesting thing in the national scene around disability services, because healthcare reform really makes a difference to people with disabilities, and particularly people who require long-term services and supports, because Medicaid funds it. And without those national alliances with other allies, it's much harder to fight that fight.
So I want to raise our third sort of area of talking about disability, and as I mentioned before, that's about your experiences being disabled or with disability here in university spaces. And I'm going to ask you to be a little bit briefer, and then we'll just let the audience address the same thing. But then let's just do everything in the next 40 some odd minutes. So I do want to revisit whatever has arisen for you all in the room while you're listening, but also think about disability in these spaces. So with regard to disability, what is the University of Minnesota doing well? What could the U be doing better? You might describe something that worked for you while you were in college on the University of Minnesota campus. What made a difference? What advice do you have for students, faculty, or staff who are learning about disability culture for the first time? And I think it would be interesting to brainstorm some next steps. What's the next frontier for disability culture in at the University of Minnesota? What is the next step to fostering culture and community around disability issues on campus?
All right, so I guess I'll first start talking about what I guess for me what worked so far in my college experience. I guess I'll start with so what's worked for me, I guess, is thinking back to when I first started. I guess just doing that initial visit at the DRC, that really helped because I got to talk with someone and got an idea of like. I guess the first question, how many, is there disability culture on campus? And then also, like, how many people, I guess in a sense, look like me? And, like, are there other blind people on campus as well? Because sometimes, it could be a little isolated if, when you're on campus and there are not too many people that have the same experiences that you have or similar. So I guess just meeting with someone and then getting told that, there's the DSCC. And also there's a couple people that I know of, or there's a couple people here who have experiences similar to yours, and that there are other blind and low vision folks who go here. So that was pretty cool getting connected with them, and I actually got to establish friendships with a good number of them. They happen to also be in the DSCC, and we met through that student group, and then got to do a lot more outside of it as well. Got to, I guess, exchange ideas on how to navigate certain obstacles, both on the university and off campus. So I guess that's one thing that's worked well. And then in terms of the university itself, I guess I'd have to say what they're doing well as currently is, first off, I guess, having the spaces to have these dialogues is one, because usually that could be tough to do the first step. So I guess just having these conversations, and I guess addressing any That way, folks can present questions, and if there are any discomforts, or it's just more of just exchanging ideas and learning about one another. Trying to figure out what. I guess I'll have my colleagues kind of give more of a perspective on what we could further improvements.
Okay, I'm gonna try to be briefer, Tammy. And I think the fact that we don't have enough time just shows how big this and important of a topic this is. I think that one thing that the university is doing very well is I think a lot of really amazing work is happening in the DRC. I love the DRC, and one thing that I love most about the DRC is that the folks that I've interacted with through the DRC are very open to saying we need to do better about this, or we need to learn more about this, or we realize we don't know enough about brain injuries, or we realize we need to do better to serve graduate students, or we have this limitation and this is what we're trying to do. And so I love that the DRC is trying to do so much and is so open to thinking about what else needs to happen. I think that that's really admirable and respectful, and I respect that a lot. I think there needs to be a broader institutional shift that happens on this campus because academia as an institution is based on an ableist framework, right? We bring the best, most smartest people, right, to come study here, or the best, most talented athletes to come and play sports ball here, right? So I think that we have to have an institutional shift, and I can talk literally forever about that, so that's all I'm going to say. One thing that I think that's worked really, really well for me was meeting other disabled graduate students, which didn't happen for me until I had been in graduate school for like 5 years. And it first happened by folks at other universities. The other things that's happened that's been in just phenomenal impact on my life is having disabled mentors, to have a PhD faculty mentor, or folks like Tammy who are disabled and identify as disabled and went through what I'm going through, made all of the difference to me. So I would like to see more disabled faculty on this campus. And the last thing that I think is really important is that if we're wanting to be the land-grant institution that we say we are, we need to serve the students that are in our population, and that includes disabled students, and that means we need to have curriculum that reflects and responds to the life experiences of those students. So the fact that there is not a disability studies major for undergrads or graduate students on this campus, to me, is just appalling. There are small schools all over this country that have disability studies programs, and we have nothing, and it is, I think, just a tragedy if we look at our institutional peers. And I have an entire curriculum for a DS program that I dream in my sleep when I can't sleep at night, of the classes I want to offer and I want this university to offer around disability arts and culture, and disability activist history, and disability from a feminist perspective, and I could go on and on and on and on, and I will not. But there's a lot of work to be done here, and I am excited that the OED is starting that or encouraging that with holding panels like this one.
I had a lot of positive experiences here as a student, but my undergrad years, I didn't really have a lot of faculty who were really supportive. I can think of only one or two. And so, but my graduate level work here, my master's program, the professors were just really open to me writing all my papers about disability or deafness, or talking about disability in the classroom. I was studying higher ed administration, so I wanted to talk about disability services and other things related to higher ed, or disability in higher ed, and they were very open to that, and that was really helpful for me. So one of the things I wanted to say, that even I too would like to have a disability studies program here, but if that's not going to happen, I do think that professors can do a lot to kind of use disability into their curriculum, to think about ways to talk about disability the same way you're bringing up gender or race or other things in your classes.
So on the positive side,
That mic's not,
put the mic closer.
I don't know if it's on. I think I mean like that.
It looks like the battery is low.
Okay, is that better? Great. So on the positive side, as an instructor and as an employer of people with disabilities on campus, I feel very well supported as a person who teaches courses and who hires people with disabilities. So I think that's really positive. And I think the one thing this university could do is employ more people with disabilities in all roles on campus.
I promised myself I wasn't going to say very much, but if I could just add one plug for disability studies, it doesn't just transform the lives of people with disabilities, it transforms the perspective of everyone in a community, and it puts people in relationship. We've talked about isolation up here. And you know, from a practical perspective, there is no area of human existence that is not inflected with disability experience. Healthcare, education, help me out, guys. Athletics. I mean, basically any moment in the human lifespan, there encounters disability in some way, and we would all do well to infuse our community with that, not just for us sitting up here, not just for us in this room, but for every student at the University of Minnesota. So I'd like to thank everybody for putting up with me and open the discussion up to everybody else. Somebody willing to be a...
Oh, I have it. So we're going to use this microphone, and if you can just kind of hold it like this, I'll bring it to whoever has a question or comment. Okay.
Can you say your name, Amanda?
Sure. Yes. Amanda Klepp. I work in the Office for Conflict Resolution. Just curious what has been done at this point so far about getting a disability studies program going, and what, if anything, has been the pushback or feedback?
I think we both can. So I've been at the University of Minnesota for 15 years, and I was approached very early on in my tenure by Alex Lubet in music, and we had kind of a steering group, and of that collaboration was born the Disability Symposium, which has happened 5 times, I think, or something. It's been hard to keep the momentum, I think, because it's been very grassroots, and I'm not here, I'm out in Morris, so I don't know where the disconnects have been, but I believe there is a very modest graduate minor in the School of Audiology, but maybe you guys could correct me if I'm wrong. But it might, so that is no longer the case. Oh, Donna.
Hold on, Donna. Oh, thanks.
This is Donna Johnson from the DRC, and I was involved with the group that Tammy's talking about as well. And there were various academic departments who said that they would take on a disability studies minor or a disability studies major, exploring that. And the last group was audiology. There were courses that were offered through that program, and then it kind of seemed to have gone away. And so it's constantly a work in progress, and I think it's been talked about for the 26 years that I've been here, so.
A few professors here actually wrote a chapter for a book about what happened at the U, and this has been one of the problems, is that disability studies is seen as a medical related thing, and disability studies is it can be medical, but because disabled people have such a long history of being oppressed by medicine, it's not the greatest idea to put the disability studies program into any medical thing, including audiology. So I think that's been part of the problem.
We can take turns. We can take turns. So I have gotten some really great support in my department, and my department is now offering a feminist disability studies class, 30 GWIS 3215, that I teach at the undergrad level, and we're working on a 4000 level class, more specifically focused on sexuality and disability for the future. So my department is trying to build some disability curriculum. I think that I'm not involved with the symposium and the group that you mentioned, Tammy, and I think that there has been some fizzle. It sort of has started and done some things and fizzled out and started and done some things. And I think that I just want to sort of expand what Wendy was saying, that for me, when I'm thinking about disability studies, I'm thinking about classes that help us understand disability as a socio-cultural and political and historical category. So I'm not wanting classes on how do we help disabled people find jobs, or how do we do physical therapy, or how do we manage fixing disability in the medical model. And there needs to be, those are sort of things that have been categorized as applied disability. And I'm not downing that in any way. Applied disability fields are really great. I love my OT therapist. My OT therapist has changed my life. So OT and work and organizations that do this kind of practical how to help disabled people, there is a very important need for that work. What I think we also need on this campus, there is some of that. What we need is a way to think critically about how disability operates in society as a category of meaning making that intersects with all these other categories like race and class and gender and sexuality, right? And that's what we don't have. We don't have it coming from the CLA in the ways that I think we need to have on this campus, and I don't know why. But I'm going to keep making noise until I graduate and leave, or until it happens. So.
The cynical person in me says follow the money, and that's why. So I think that that's a big part of it. I think another real barrier is we have departments and we have colleges on this campus, and this issue spans lots of them. And so the ability to be flexible and have a program that spans across various colleges is a big barrier. If we could figure out how to do that, we would have had a disability studies program decades ago here.
Okay, hold on 1 minute. Okay. Where were-
I think intersectionality is an issue on this campus because race and disability don't intersect well, and since I'm a slow typist, my mom will explain the experience I am thinking about.
Kate was invited to the TRIO 75th anniversary that happened in October. There were probably 500 people there. It's mainly about people of color, which she is one. We sat at a table that had 12 seats. People stood and held their plates and wouldn't come and sit at our table even when they were invited. A couple people came by, started to sit down, looked at Kate, and walked off. And then we left because it got to be not very much fun. So you're talking about, and I don't think anybody noticed because it was a disability, where if it had been, she had been the only woman in a group full of men or the only person of color in a group full of white people, there would have been a huge hullabaloo.
Thank you. That's a number one reason to get disability studies here, is to put people in relationships. I just want to say that again.
TRIO is a federally funded program. It's supposed to work with students of color, first-generation students, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and people with disabilities, just for the record. TRIO has historically struggled with not necessarily doing enough around disability. And so I am sorry to say that I'm not very surprised to hear that there were problems at a TRIO event. I've heard things like that before. Some TRIO offices are amazing. And some TRIO offices function as the Disability Services Office on their campus. But unfortunately, there are also TRIO offices that just don't know a lot about disability. And the other thing, too, is I've worked with a lot of students who use communication systems as their voice. And we've really bonded because I often have other people voicing for me. And I think, too, there's some issues there with people not understanding that you can be learning disabled but still learn, that you can have an intellectual disability and be an intellectual, that you can speak through a computer and have a lot to say. I think there are some misconceptions there in higher ed in general about the best ways to communicate and speak and hear and learn. And if you don't fit those boxes, it's possible and very unfortunately very likely that it's not just TRIO events where there will be problems with feeling welcome. So I'm sorry that you experienced that.
I'm also really sorry to hear that was Kate's experience. I was a McNair scholar in undergrad, so I was a TRIO program person, and I became disabled during my TRIO summer of research, my summer research internship. And I would not have finished college if it wasn't for the TRIO program at my school. I would not be here. When I had a bunch of medical doctors and a bunch of vocational therapists and people telling me that people with disabilities like mine didn't even finish college, let alone go to graduate school, the TRIO program was the space for me on my campus that said, yes, you can. If you want to do this, we're going to help you figure out how to do this. So I do think that it has a lot to do with the relationships that are built, the connections that are made, the work that's done in each of these spaces to build solidarity across difference, to think about the ways in which we experience oppression. I also wanted to say that I have had, I think that there is a big problem with disability literacy or an understanding of disability on this campus, which is what you were getting to, Wendy. This idea that people say, oh, well, if you have a cognitive disability, then you can't be doing this work. Oh, if you have a communication disability or an intellectual disability, then you can't be doing this. I had, on my first semester as a graduate student on this campus, I had a professor say, what do you mean you need accommodations? You're so smart, you write such great papers. And I just like floored, and so there's this constant thing that, well, you can't be disabled and smart at the same time, or you can't be disabled and do whatever at the same time. And I think that's one of the broader shifts that needs to happen on this campus, is a way for folks, professors, staff, other students to understand that you can be disabled and do all kinds of things. Jacob, to you. We met and talked together and realized that Jacob's on a panel with a lot of very opinionated women, and so we wanted to be conscious of letting Jacob have the mic. Do you have?
Hi, I'm Jim. I was connecting a few things that were being said in a new way of thinking about them, especially with the disabled, and privilege. Like you were saying, you were talking about you need to recognize areas where you're privileged. And I started connecting some things in that privilege to disabled and maybe disadvantaged, and just trying to understand that sometimes we'll say, okay, maybe somebody has a empathy disability, if you're thinking of certain people. But I'm just trying to think of privilege, that maybe one thing to understand with a disability is also privilege. And I can see that, and I'm trying to take that in my mind too. And does this ring to anyone, that making a connection between privilege and understanding one's privileges to understand disabilities?
I think I might see what you're getting at. Does anybody else want to respond before I do? I think that what becoming disabled helped me think about was all the things I took for granted, and um, all the ways that I had internalized ableism in myself, before I became disabled, right? To value certain ways of being and knowing and moving through the world, unconsciously. And so that really shifted for me when I came to understand that there are lots of different ways to be and know and exist in the world, and they're all equally valid. And should be equally valid in society. I think that when I mentioned earlier thinking about my white privilege or my passing privilege, or now, as a graduate student, my economic privilege, and that I mean that on my graduate stipend, that is economic privilege from the working class background that I come from. But I have the privilege of having great health care as a graduate student. That means that I can go to OT, and I can have 8 different doctors, and I can have the privilege of an education system that, through various programs like McNair, I was able to get through and understand how to navigate these systems. And so that makes my experience of disability very different than somebody who wouldn't have health care or wouldn't have education or wouldn't have the support system that I have. So when I think about my privilege in relationship to disability, I do think that becoming disabled has allowed me to think about the world differently, and I don't know that I would call that a privilege, but I do think it as a benefit, right? So the fancy academic word is the epistemology, right? The way of knowing. And so the disability studies word is CRIP epistemology, right? The disabled way of knowing. And I have now a disabled way of knowing in the world that has allowed me to think differently about bodies and minds and connections and people that I didn't have before. So I see the world in a different way now, and I think that is a great benefit, and that's why I do the work that I do. I don't necessarily think that's a social privilege, though, because that knowledge that I have as a disabled person isn't valued by able-bodied society. Able-bodied society doesn't give a shit what I know about bodies and minds. They think that I'm not smart because I have struggles making sentences after 3 o'clock because I'm in pain, right? So I think that privilege is a complicated word. Does anyone else want to add to that question?
I would just go back to, I also have a 9-year-old, and just last night at dinner, we were talking about some bullies in the 4th grade at his school, and it was interesting because when you said the disabled ways of knowing, one of the things we were talking about is it possible that those bullies have disabilities? Okay, and that's a different frame of reference than most kids are going to hear. And we realized that bully may have some kind of mental health issue going on. The bully has difficulty with interacting with other kids. Maybe the bully is autistic. Maybe, we was talking about those things. And I have an exercise I do the first day of class with teachers, and I ask them to tell me about the teachers they had with disabilities. And there's never anyone who had a teacher with a disability. And so then we talk about, what about other teachers that kids thought acted weird or were really, really geeky, like excessively geeky? Or what about the teachers who maybe had a hard time hearing you? What about the teachers with the really thick glasses? Well, we start going through the list, and all of a sudden they realize they all had teachers with disabilities. So I think that's one of the things that privilege really means for me is there's an invisibility that happens, and I think one way to be an ally is to just rip that apart and always assume the person you're talking to has a disability. And start there and assume people are disabled instead of assuming that they aren't, and see how your world changes.
I just want to say that one other thing that I think disability culture accomplishes is just, drawing circles around the joy of being in the world with a disability. There are many, many joys, and many discourses tend to not wrongly, tend to focus on barriers and oppression. And those discourses are valid and real, but so is joy. And so I just wanted, art is, often very joyous. And so I just wanted to say that one huge thing that happens is just realizing that people have many, many, many ways of being happy and joyous and fulfilled in the world.
Do we have other comments or questions? Over here, hold on. Excuse me.
Yeah, you had touched on one thing that really caught my attention because it also goes to some area that I work in. Issues of getting faculty with disabilities into the higher education system. Of course, it's hard to do that when there is not necessarily a great deal of advocacy, policy, or research work done in the issues of intersectionality between post-baccalaureate education and disability, and both the dearth of research and work that's done there and the great differences that exist between students in baccalaureate education versus students in post-baccalaureate, and how we move towards better supporting such students. Again, as certainly most of the panelists know, but also at least half of the room knows, I am involved with work and Sarah is as well, with creating an organization for graduate and professional students with disabilities on this campus that's been going on this semester. And we're looking at those issues, but it's a broader issue than just that organization or this campus. And in order to get faculty with disabilities into the system, we need to implement mentoring and support mechanisms for students with disabilities in post-baccalaureate education so that we can get them through the system. So the question becomes, how do we actually do that? How do we address those needs? What becomes best practices? And how do we shift the discussion while keeping the critical work that is ongoing in all the other areas of disability, not limiting those areas at all, but expanding the work to encompass post-baccalaureate?
I just wanted to say I encourage you to look at the clearinghouse. The brochures are over there with the propaganda. The NCCSD clearinghouse, if you look, we have a whole bunch of resources for disabled faculty and graduate students. There's also an organization called Chronically Academic that you should check out for professors and graduate students with disabilities. So I encourage you to look at those.
Okay.
Having been a professor with a disability and having done research with graduate students who have disabilities, one of the things that really bothers me is there's often an enormous amount of work that you do behind the scenes that is really service to the university. You're arranging your own accommodations, doing work, extra work for classes, doing extra work of mentoring, all of that is also experienced by many faculty of color and women. And so one thing I did want to say is I do think that it's important to acknowledge that somehow. So whether it's your graduate school advisor understands exactly what you're doing behind the scenes, or you're putting that on your annual report about your service to the university, I think that's one really critical step to kind of raise awareness So whenever I talk to faculty, I encourage them to be sure that it's not, that doesn't make it complaining. That makes it just a fact. Just as a fact, at Syracuse University, I coordinated all my own interpreters. That was part of my job. So it went down every year on my report as service to the university. Okay, so that kind of thing. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Ryan, there's a really great book coming out, or I think it's going to be a really great book. It's an edited anthology that I co-authored a chapter in with 3 of my friends, and it came out of a conference called Disability Disclosure in Higher Education. And the book anthology is coming out later in the fall, and I can't remember the title of the book because it's that time of day for me. So I can get that to you or anyone else if you want to email me. I can get it to you once I look it up. The chapter that I co-authored with 3 other graduate students with disabilities was called Body Minds Like Ours, and it was talking about how the university isn't set up, or graduate education isn't set up for disabled graduate students in various ways. And so we sort of broke that down into the very reasons why and the systems, ideological and structural systems in higher education, and why that didn't work for us, to try to sort of get exactly to this. So I think there is lots of work happening and people across the nation and even internationally thinking about these questions. But part of the problem, I think, that is that just as disability can be an isolating experience, disability studies scholarship is also an isolating experience. There's 2 or 3 of us in little pockets, you know, Tammy's in Morris, and some of us are here, and, you know, we're all doing these things and caring about these things, but it's making connections, not even across our own campus, but across other campuses, because for disabled scholars, it's harder to maybe to travel, or it's harder to make some of these connections than some of our able-bodied-minded peers can do. So I think there's a lot of work out there. We just have to keep trying to be in connection with one another and be in connection with other groups, as Tammy mentioned, that that also struggle with this. So I'm thinking about the anthology as Assumed Incompetent, that's predominantly about women of color professors and their experience with a lot of these same struggles.
I just wanted to wonder if the book that your essay is in is edited by Stephanie Kirschbaum.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Do you
So,
remember?
no, but the editor's name is Stephanie Kirschbaum with a K-E-R, Kirschbaum.
I have a chapter in there too.
Oh.
Sorry, Stephanie.
Maybe time for one more comment, just a minute.
How far away do I hold this?
Just right about
There, okay. You've elucidated many very complicated and sophisticated concepts, and I appreciate it very much being here. I'd like to ask, though, a very simple level, straightforward sort of question, and that is that years ago, there was a cultural issue in the non-hearing community about accepting or rejecting cochlear implants. And I wonder what the latest is on that, or if nothing has changed, or is there a cultural shift, or what should I know about that?
Why did they give me the mic? Well, I think there's been some progress in terms of people being more open-minded about adults getting cochlear implants, and also about children getting implants, but also learning to sign. And so I think there's been some shifts on that. But there is still a sizable group of people who do believe that it's a form of genocide, because there are audiologists and doctors who are very open about the fact that they're trying to eliminate deaf people, and as a group, and that's genocide. So, if you're interested in that topic, there's a fabulous book I can't recommend enough called Made to Hear, and it's by a woman named Laura Malden, LDIN, and it explores how parents' first messages about deafness are from doctors, and how they're very much encouraged to never, ever, ever use sign language, but many of them do it on the side, in private, in secret, and they hide it from the doctors. And how disability studies may be one answer to resolving some of the historical conflicts between the deaf community and the medical community, that disability studies may offer us a path forward. So it's a fabulous book. I highly encourage it. Yeah.
This is Dan speaking. I do myself have a cochlear implant. I just wanted to add to what Wendy was saying, that adults can have we have an open mind for adults to accept that for themselves. But the issue with giving a cochlear implant to a young child depends upon how much support and information is provided to the parents prior to doing that. Some parents are given all the options, and that's great. That's what we really recommend. But some doctors really only provide one solution, that the only option is to implant the child. And that's not helpful in giving the parents and family information to consider. And the reason the deaf community is so upset about this is because it's taking away the identity of that deaf child. Because if you take off the cochlear implant, that child's deaf. If you put the cochlear implant on, they can hear. So that child is always going to be deaf. So parents need to be educated, and doctors need to be educated as well. And there does need to be improvement in that area.
I got my cochlear implant while I was living in Syracuse, and my students were great, my colleagues were great, my family was great. The deaf community totally was not great. They were, I felt very, very excluded after I got my implant. And that contributed to me moving back to Minnesota, because the deaf community here is far more open about things like me talking or having an implant but still identifying as big D deaf. So yeah, it's still out there.
I should have said my name. It's Emily Anderson. And I think I'd like to ask about the logistics, one might say, of your participating, for example, in your 4-year study. Are there funds for you to have signers if that aids your participation? Or I'm guessing that the academic community is quite asleep about that issue and that financial burden.
The law requires most organizations have to pay for the interpreters for me. So it's not coming out of my pocket. If I go to the doctor or the clinic or the entire clinic system is paying for my interpreter. Here at the university, it's not the responsibility of the English department to pay for interpreters or accommodations for the student in the English classes. It's the whole entire university. I always tell campuses you have to get rid of the football team before you say you can't afford my interpreters. And that usually wakes them up quite a bit. But we're not getting rid of the football team. Yeah, so that's in terms of accommodations in general. It rarely would fall on me to pay. The only exceptions would be like personal things, like my wedding. I had to pay for the interpreter. A funeral, I had to pay for the interpreter. Often there were volunteers who were willing to help out, friends who interpret, but that's really the only time you should be paying.
But you mentioned that part of your service, I think when you were in Syracuse, was that you coordinated your signers. So that's
Right,
kind of
but
a
I didn't
gray
pay
area.
for 'em.
Well,
Yeah.
your time.
Yeah, faculty and staff are often required to go to human resources. Here at the university, they have a very rare model where you go to the Disability Resource Center, but at most campuses, faculty and many graduate students and staff would have to either arrange their own accommodations with their dean or department head, or they'd have to go to HR, and it creates a real climate of fear to disclose to your boss that you have a disability or you need a medical leave, my interpreters cost a fortune. And there were also misunderstandings. I just need to tell this. I'll be very quick. Very funny. So the agency that sent out interpreters, if it was last minute request, if it was within 24 hours of the meeting or whatever, it was called an emergency request. And the guy in the dean's office who handled all the paperwork from my interpreter jobs noticed that I was having a lot of emergencies at Starbucks. And it was just meetings with students that were last minute, right? A student was having a crisis. They called me. I set up interpreters. It was labeled an emergency. We met at Starbucks. And he's like, something's wrong if you're having emergencies at Starbucks all the time. So I had to explain, and I wouldn't have had to explain if that was going through a disability resource center. They would have understood what they were seeing. But this poor guy, he didn't know. And he thought maybe he needed to alert the dean that I'm having all these emergencies at Starbucks. There was something wrong, and it wasn't. It was me doing my job.
We wanted to say that we got the name of the book. Is that okay? Wendy, do you want to?
So with the name, I was able to Google it. So the name is Negotiating Disability Disclosure in Higher Education. So, and did you say that 3 of you have chapters in it? 2, okay. Awesome. Yes, so it's Negotiating Disability Disclosure in Higher Education, and Tammy was right, so Stephanie Kirschbaum is one of the co-editors of the book. On the website, it just says forthcoming, so.
Tammy, did you want to wrap up anything? Because we're about out of time, unfortunately.
Sure. So thank you for coming. I think this has been a great discussion. I think we were worried initially about having enough to say. So I feel pretty successful, and I just want to thank everybody for coming, especially on such a beautiful day.